I'm finding recently that the challenge has been greater, and I think it's because Zoom is getting overloaded. I think that's the problem. But anyway, so can I welcome you all this afternoon to the third in this series, where we're looking at different ethical questions. The question today being regarding democracy. And if democracy is there for the majority, then what happens to the minority? I think there's some really very, very interesting questions to be discussed here, and I'm looking forward to hearing what our panelists have to say. So I wonder, I haven't got you down in alphabetical order, but perhaps I wonder whether Father Andrew might like to begin.
Thank you, Maurice. I'm Andrew Wagstaff. I'm one of the priests at the Sacred Heart Catholic Church on Richmond Hill, central Bournemouth. I should just say I need to go promptly at 4, I'm afraid, because I've got another meeting afterwards. So if I disappear, I'm sorry, that's the reason. Limits to democracy. Churchill was supposed to have said that democracy is the worst way to run a country apart from all the others. What he actually said was, many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. In the context that he was speaking, which was 1947, he was no doubt talking about dictatorship in particular as some of the other forms that have been tried from time to time. And he was speaking in the wake of a war which was won by democracies fighting dictatorships. But if we take a look back at the 70 years of democracy that we've enjoyed since the end of that conflict, what criticisms can we make about it? What limits, indeed, can we identify? The first limit I would identify to democracy, or at least the effective limit to democracy, not a theoretical one, is a limit of choice. Formal democracy, like we have, is effectively actually just a choice between, for the vast majority of us, a choice between competing elites. Now, some would say this was a good thing because it makes it more stable, and that actually having, if you like, literal equality as an element of democracy is quite a dangerous idea. Rousseau, who thought that democracy should be about literal equality, said that that kind of formal democracy is akin to slavery. I wouldn't go that far, but I would say that it can result in a kind of collusion between the competing elites, effectively to narrow the field of choice. So in most parts of the UK now, the reality is that most of us get to choose between from 2 to 6, depending on where we live, 2 to 6 kinds of social democrat. There isn't actually that much variety. Populism, therefore, can arise where people feel that they are not being represented within democracy. And for the elites of a formal democracy, that populism then becomes synonymous with extremism, which in turn causes instability. And I'm going to mention it now, which is what we saw on the 6th of January during the riot at the Capitol in America. In other words, for the mad in the street, there's a danger that the professional political class can become seen as untrustworthy. The second limit to identify is a limit to subsidiarity. Because the democracy is, as it were, closest to the people at the most local level, where you have a formal democracy that becomes increasingly elite, that can tend to centralize power away from local people. A few examples of this would be the rise of the influence of the federal government in America, as opposed to the state governments during, well, the whole period from FDR onwards. Another example might be a very recent one, the coordination failures of the European Union when it comes to vaccine distribution, which individual states within the EU have apparently found quite frustrating. You could even give the example, ironically, of devolution as a centralizing tendency, because in order to justify their existence, devolved assemblies in parts of the UK have drawn power away from more local levels of government. An example of this might be that Scotland now has just one police force and one fire brigade, although historically it was made up of many different city and county forces and brigades. A third limit I would identify as a limit to freedom. And for this, I want to take the example of Socrates. Socrates was actually against Athenian democracy because he suspected it of being susceptible to sophistry. In other words, he thought that powerful rhetorical figures could manipulate democracy. I would say the modern equivalent of that is the use of the media and social media to promote political ideas and indeed to censor some other political ideas. So recently, again in America, we've seen some politicians and their supporters actually being censored, being suspended, or being banned from using social media, which have an effective monopoly over much of public discourse now. Again, this results in a hegemony of elites. Politics, technology, and media form an alliance, and that could be perceived as being an alliance against the people. Now, a good example of this I would give you is Brexit. Indeed, I think that it was actually the consistency of the elites in politics, media, and technology in being pro-European. It was actually that consistency, ironically, that persuaded many ordinary people to vote leave. So it was the side of David Cameron, Nick Clegg, Tony Blair, Barack Obama, all joining ranks that put many people off the pro-European cause. And then finally, I want to say there's a limit to reason, because democracy can appear to confer a moral entitlement on the winner to do anything they please, which can result in laws changing and changing very rapidly, and sometimes from going between administrations from one extreme to another and back again. Thomas Aquinas would say that was inherently a bad thing because it brings the law into disrepute by changing it too often, by averring that it was wrong in the past in too many cases. It makes it virtually impossible for the citizen to know the law, and it risks making bad laws on a whim. So democracy, in other words, can appear to entitle the government of the day to exceed its remit. Historically, of course, Churchill's reason for thinking that democracy was the best of a bad job was that it tended to prevent public unrest and riots. I would just ask you if that's really still the case, or perhaps has it failed in that most basic of its aims?
Andrew, thank you very much. That was really very, very interesting and wonderful way to start our conversation this afternoon. I think, is it Gareth who's going to be speaking next?
I am indeed, sir. Yes.
Wonderful, Gareth. I look forward to hearing you.
So slightly less polished than your previous speaker, but potentially coming at it from a slightly different angle for you. My background, if you don't know me, is hospital medicine. From hospital medicine, I went into studies of medical ethics and law, and then I've ended up doing a fair degree of community work, and I'm now the chief executive of the YMCA down here, as well as an ordained minister, working locally in Bournemouth. And my interest in this topic is really from a perspective of the power of the individual and the power of the state. And that, to a degree, focuses in on some of the subject matter that we're looking at when it comes to can a democracy effectively being used for tyranny to oppress the minority from the perspective of the majority. And if you look at the history of democracy going back the last 2,500 years, it's peppered with examples of where the sway of public opinion has ended up in levels of tyranny. And most recently, we can see some of the possibilities coming in areas of the world that we're in now. But if you go back through the history books, and as previous speaker spoke about, when you look at Nazi Germany and the rise of Hitler to power in the 1930s, it's really a fascinating view of what can happen to democratic decision making and governments when people rise to power. And I think it's important to point out, and this is where democracy is often misunderstood, democracy is not usually the majority that gets to sway the public opinion and to get to sway government. If you look at the rise of Adolf Hitler, he had a tiny minority in the 1930s, but because of his small minority and because of the lack of somebody with a majority, it was that minority vote that actually got the sway of the opinion. He got the chancellorship, got 2 of his men into high positions of power, and then we get the rise of Nazi socialism, and we get the Nazi Party. And so when we look at democracy itself, and when you get votes that come in, very rarely do you get a majority vote. You just get the largest of the minority vote. And it's the largest minority that tends to swing the balance of power. And if it can't form a majority opinion in government, then it becomes a conglomeration of a few. And we've seen that recently, even within our own parliament, when you saw the Liberal Democrat Party and the Conservative Party join forces for a period of time in order to bring about any substantial change in government opinion. It's also important to recognize in most democratic cultures that it is the law that governs the society. And democracy is a method of bringing about representation to bring about new laws. And so democracy actually depends on a stable legal system and a framework of laws. And therefore it is the majority culture that starts to frame the changes in laws and brings about a change in society. And that majority opinion and that majority expression can be influenced by a vast array of different things. And so you go back into the Nazi Germany and the rise of Nazi Germany, the propaganda machine was informing public opinion and getting people on board. And we see that again and again. History is replete with examples of people's opinions being formulated by the effective media of the day. And prior to the existence of widespread communication, what you had was local governance. And then during the Industrial Revolution, you see that moving to central governments. And now in the information age, we're seeing the rise of disparate groups and opinions formed across boundaries of government and culture that are starting to influence the thinking of people. And we see that with the influence of Brexit as a classic example. And I think one of the interesting trends that I'm seeing in democratic decision-making and government is that it's actually no longer the majority itself that's forming opinion, but it's actually the people that form the questions the majority vote for. A simple example of that would be when my children were younger and I was going to town, I wouldn't ask them if they want to go to town. I'd say, we're going to town. Do you want ice cream or do you want a donut? And they would think that they had a choice when they didn't, because I'm giving them no choice about whether they go to town or not. I'm letting them choose within the boundaries of what I told them they're doing. And within democracy, we see, even with our own culture, and Brexit was a fascinating experiment in this, that a simple decision, yes or no, actually buried beneath it layers of complexity that the majority had a variety of opinions on. And we would have ended up with a very different result if we'd have asked a very different question. Do you want to stay in the European Economic Area? Not, do you want to be part of the EU? And those questions themselves betray something underlying democratic rule, government, and those that lead us, which is something that relates to me in my medical profession and history. It's this question of informed consent. Democracy essentially is representation and government by consent. But if the consent is not informed, then democracy is in itself a form of oligarchy or a form of autocracy, because what we're actually doing is controlling the decisions people can make, and in doing so, suppressing their expression or suppressing their will. Brexit was an example of people being given a yes or no decision, whereas underneath it, there were so many layers of consent and so many layers of issues. And nobody voted on those issues. You had to condense your opinions on all of those issues into a yes or a no decision. And so, of course, at the back end of it, we've got so many people saying, well, I didn't really vote for that. I didn't really vote for this. And that is because there is a lack of informed consent that's being put in to these decisions, in the same way that I would sit down with a patient and say, well, we're going to have to lop your leg off. I had one consultant that used to turn around and say, we're just going to chop it off about here. You'll be fine. You'll be fine. And that was his informed consent, please sign. Whereas I would have to go down and sit and say, this is what can happen. This is the result. This is the reason we're doing these procedures. This is what we're offering. And the person can say yes or no. We don't have that to a high degree in our democratic process right now. We depend on information systems like the media to inform the people, to create debate, systems like this, to start asking these questions. And yet at a government level, there's shielding of a lot of these issues, and we're not given an opinion on those, or we're not given permission to express. On the back end of the information age, I think we might be looking at a new type of democracy where people are expressing opinions on multiple different things, rather than just simple yes and no questions. That's the end of my talk.
Gareth, thank you very much. Again, very stimulating. My pen is running away with itself as I keep making notes of what you and before you, Andrews, had to say. So thank you very much. Ian, I'm in the unfortunate position of not being able to use my computer, and so I'm having to use a phone, which means I only get to see the person who's speaking. So I don't know which of our other speakers are actually present.
Is Paul Taylor on board? Doesn't seem to be. Is Professor Stuart Bartholomew on board? Doesn't seem to be. I think. No, apparently I phoned up. Apparently Ben Hargrave, Chief Superintendent Ben Hargraves, was called off on police business and sends apologies. But we've had two really good introductions there from different perspectives. I'd be tempted, if I was in the chair, Maurice, to open it up to the audience and get a wider range of reaction at this point.
What a wonderful idea. What a wonderful idea, Ian. Yeah, I'd be very happy. And you know, if anybody in the audience would like to comment, and because we've only had the two speakers, that gives those of you in the audience a little more time to be able to pull together some of your thoughts rather than just a very, very quick comment. So if you'd like to, I'd like to open it. But as I say, Ian, I can't see who's going to be putting up their hands or anything. So can you look at that bit for me?
Yep, I can keep an eye on that.
Thank you.
Anybody putting up a hand? Let's see, what can I? Or maybe we need to go to unmuting yourself. Actually, I think you are all unmuted. Oh, no, you're not. Let's unmute every. So if you'd like to continue to take part in the discussion, and we hope you would, do unmute yourself and speak. Let's try that.
Okay, I'll jump in. Nobody else?
David Wheeler, Dr. David Wheeler.
It's really a question about democracy and religion. And it's an awkward one, I think. I don't know the answer to it. Do the panelists think that democratic means can overcome basic human greed, enabling us to overcome mass species extinction through climate, plastic pollution, etc., etc.? What's the limit to what was said to be informed consent? How informed are we? Can we be?
Do you want to take that one, Gareth?
Yes, happy to take that one. So, yes, limits to informed consent. It does this. Effectively, what you're saying is, does the selfish nature of humanity lend itself to a crisis of democracy? I think if you look at, let's take the last 240 years of American democracy. If you look at the roadmap of the rolling of generations and how the generations have shaped themselves. There's been a seasonality over a period of about 4 generations. The Romans used to describe it as the seculum. And these 4 generations would begin with a generation that overcame a crisis, then led to a generation that lived under the new institutions that came out of that crisis. The next generation would challenge those institutions and create disruption. And then the generation after them would live in a lack of respect for the institution, a lack of trust in government, and something you will read in the sociology books described as rugged individualism. And so the 1920s in the United States is a classic example of rugged individualism, the Roaring Twenties, which then accumulated to another crisis, which was both the Great Depression and then rolling into the Second World War, which led to a transformation and then new institutions coming out the back end of that. And really, we are in a season right now of crisis on the back end of rugged individualism. And what you see in cultures is you see that if they survive it, if democracy survives the crisis, then on the back end of it is you get the renewal of the shared corporate you ought to do this. And I was speaking to somebody even today about it, and isn't it fascinating that 2 or 3 years ago, if you'd have turned around to a bunch of university students and say, you cannot go to nightclubs, you cannot go out, you have to stay at home, you cannot be drinking too much, you can't be doing all of these things, we'd have been thought as religious imbeciles that didn't know what we were talking about. And yet now we live in a culture and society where everybody's policing themselves. Oh, no, you can't go and do that. No, we've got to be careful about socialization. Have you thought about everybody else and the effect your behavior is having on everybody else? And that is complete shift from individualism to corporate responsibility. And so we are witnessing the process of a cultural mindset transition from me, my rights, individualism focus to oughtness, shared responsibility, looking after the community, and an us mentality when it comes to culture. So do I think British democracy will survive it? Absolutely. We've got far too many heroes like Tom in our heritage to not think about corporate responsibility. Will it shift in the balance of religious view or some other formulation of worldview? Inevitably. But that's where the fight for the conscience of the nation is the next step in the COVID-19 crisis, and what will eventually build the oughtness and the way we should live for 1 or 2 generations to come.
Thanks, Gareth. Andrew, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, thank you, Gareth. That was very good. I don't know if I can add anything more in terms of theory. Just a couple of observations about pragmatism, I suppose. One is that I don't think it's a problem with democracy as such. There are democracies which are at the leading edge of ecological policy. So places like Australia and New Zealand, for example, are democracies, but have gone a very long way down the road that you're talking about, David. And there are states which are utterly inimical to democracy, which are massive polluters and generators of plastic. The People's Republic of China springs to mind. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's a problem with democracy. I think there's a danger that we might cast away the very valuable lessons that we've learned about democracy if we permit ourselves to suspend it in this particular emergency because it's an emergency. I mean, even in the most dire emergencies that we've faced as a nation, we've still retained democracy, even if it's been the case of our elected representatives having to devise a different form of government as they had to do during the Second World War.
Thanks, Andrew. David, does that help? Does that give you an answer?
Yes and no. I mean, I would point out.
Did you want to come back on what was being said then?
Well, I'd point out that Australia has been a climate denier. Yeah, these 4 generation cycles. But America is so split now between, shall I say, Trumpism and free will. I can carry a gun where I want. I can do exactly what I want. And it was founded on individualism, as my wife has just said. And somehow in the next 30 years, say, I mean, looking at climate, say, rather than plastic, but you know, there's so many challenges facing us. Can we give up, to some extent at least, cars, foreign travel, meat, and save the human race? And can we convince enough people to vote for a party that will go down that path? I love democracy, but I don't know. I really don't know.
And it strikes me, David, that one of the big arguments against those forces for climate change and so on were, well, economically, we couldn't possibly cope with that. And yet economically, we've now stopped travel and so on because of the coronavirus. So there are clearly crises and crises. That which is immediate seems to get a response. That which is perhaps a little way off doesn't get the same sort of response.
It's classic. Humanity has to experience a crisis before it will change its mind.
That's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah,
there's the level of that. I think, coming back to your comment about the United States, it is an interesting question, and it is a big question as to whether the United States will actually survive its current political crisis in its form.
Wow.
And you know, no more telling was it than the events of the storming of the Capitol building, where a sitting United States president called on people in a rally to march on the Capitol to undermine the results of an election. And you know, although he may have said many different things about what he really meant by those words, and in a postmodern world, what does anybody mean anymore? Is a wonderful, wasn't it? One of the American presidents. It all depends on what is. You know, I mean, really, Bill. And so, but with the crisis in the US, in political crisis, and I think it's a very genuine crisis, and they are on a very difficult tightrope now of restoring trust. And even when you listen to some of the language that Biden talks as the new president coming in, he is still creating a them and us within the United States, and there is a simmering melting pot which could undermine the whole of democracy in the United States. I genuinely have, I wouldn't say it's inevitable, but it is possible that the United States will not survive the COVID-19 crisis and the ensuing political crisis that is developed in its current form. And that means maps being redrawn and new forms of government possibly being born out of it. It's genuinely possible.
Sounds a bit scary, Gareth, actually.
Don Gobbett has had his hand up, and so's Ruth.
Right. Okay. So let's have another question then.
Don also had his hand up before me, actually.
Do you mean me?
I do mean
John, where you go.
Okay. As has been said, democracy depends on free consent of people, and that means an educated public. The media are absolutely critical in a democracy, a free press, so that people can actually get access to information. whatever one thought of Mr. Trump, he was an absolute artist at manipulating the media. And this is very often how people of power get things done, is by manipulating the media to their opinion. I don't know whether other people have any comment on that, but the relationship between the media and politicians in a democracy is critical.
Yes, it is. Yeah. John, I think there's something something that struck me about what Gareth said earlier on, about politicians wishing to shield us from some of the choices, and about us being given permission to express opinions about things. I think the media's got a big role in that, by controlling the conversation, and I think increasingly nowadays by censoring those who express opinions that aren't permitted, or who express opinions about things about which we're not permitted to express them. And you do see this with, I mean, having constructed effective monopolies on social discourse, the Twitter, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Google oligarchy then decides who they're going to permit to speak and who they're not going to permit to speak. So ironically, the internet that was supposed to democratize information has ended in the death of the free press.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And if you look at trust in the press among the general population, it is declining in line with trust in politicians, and that's a very dangerous place to be. And there seems to be a level of reduction in critical thinking skills that go alongside that. So people are absorbing an awful lot online, and there's such a plethora of different ideas, information, and people's views out there that it doesn't take much looking to find somebody you agree with and reinforce the very thought that you have. And so we are in a very difficult period of time in our own country's trajectory, in people's confidence in the information they're receiving, as well as people's confidence in their leadership. And that itself is very undermining of democracy. And I think one of the other things I pick up there is that suppression of opinion. I remember I was involved many years ago now when the Joffrey Bill, the assisted suicide law, was going through the House of Lords in 2005. And I remember a newspaper article, it was a headline newspaper, and it was basically saying that the bishops in the House of Lords should not be allowed an opinion because they come from a biased perspective. And effectively, it was saying that if you actually have a moral framework by which you live your life, you shouldn't be able to express your opinion because you're biased. And so, in a sense, suppression of opinion on the basis of what they believe about what you believe, and reducing that voice in the public sphere is a very dangerous thing to do. And that can be, with the political correct world that we have, and some of the things that we shouldn't be saying to one another in public in those ways, and should be maybe a private conversation. But at the same time, that suppression of ideas and the suppression of freedom of speech and freedom of thought is, if that is coming because democracy, the majority rule, has decided that the minority in that they should not be allowed a voice, then effectively that is the death of democracy by democracy.
I go along with that entirely, Gareth. And one of the concerns that I have with the rollout of names that Andrew gave us is that what we're seeing is a power base which has not been elected, which is totally undemocratic, and which can create and which does create news manipulates it, and is not held to account in any way, because, you know, at least if we don't like what our present government does, we can vote them out at the next election. You can't do that with these organisations, which have, you know, their turnover is, you know, is much higher than the GDP of many countries. And I think that is perhaps the biggest challenge that democracy has in our time. Can we have our next question, please? Was it Don?
Yeah, thank you. Can I make a comment on David's question? The Lord Mayor of London gave a speech this week on the greening of the economy. It's on the website of Gresham College, and I think you will find it very heartening. Basically, he was saying that the big investment finance bodies that have so much influence over us have really got the climate change agenda now and are working really hard to address it. His catchphrase within the speech was, if you come to us asking for investment, if it ain't green, go home. So I think you would find that really uplifting, as I did, David.
Thank you.
The question is, given our present company, basically, what is the biblical pattern of government, or is there one? Is it more concerned with the way decisions are made and the outcomes than any particular form of government?
Well, I mean, religion really is theocracy, not democracy. You know, you know, there is the entity which is above, you know, election results.
It's probably keeping.
But I would love Andrew to, you know, or Gareth, you know, coming to the.
I'm very interested in what Andrew's going to say to this one. I think my quick retort would be, throughout the biblical record of the 1,500 years of its authorship, it exists in a framework of multiple different styles of government, and it's certainly in Paul's instructions, you know, to honour those that rule you. I think if you look at then into the history of Christianity, it's always done better when it's not in charge, and I think that there is an element of that really that it's almost like the desire to govern, certainly in the New Testament, isn't there. The desire to serve is. And so long as there is an other focus for the benefit of those around us, for the benefit of the community, that kingdom concept of the culture of God being in the community we're in, seeking the fruits of the Spirit in the lives of people in the communities we're in, that is something that can be done outside of any political power or governments. That's something that we have the opportunity to do every day of the week to all of those around us. So I think that, but if you look in the Old Testament narrative, then certainly you can go down the Mosaic laws and find theocratic systems of law by which you would govern. So I think there's actually a slight distinction between the New Testament and Old Testament narratives of the way that culture and society should govern itself. And you can see the schism appearing in the New Testament when the decisions in the book of Acts were being made about whether or not somebody has to become Jewish and come under a system of law before they can become a Christian, or whether or not they can enter into the Christian faith and a relationship effectively with Jesus and an empowerment of the Holy Spirit separate from the institutional framework from which Christianity was born. And I think that is, as best I can, a summary of that, but I'm really interested in what Andrew's got to say.
Thanks, Gareth. I think what I'd say is I'd go back to Genesis and say, look, humanity is created in Adam in the image and likeness of God, and that includes his divine authority to rule. Adam becomes the father of a family, and as such, he is the king of the human family. Kingship, if you look in Genesis, you see the descendants of Adam. They're not all listed. The heads of the families are listed. In other words, you get a list of kings in Genesis 4:5, and so on. The whole patriarchal system of the family, the tribe, the nation, that we find in the story of Genesis derives from that principle. And so I would say that the Christian, and indeed generally the monotheistic model of government is a model in which the king or the queen is the father or the mother of the nation.
I just a couple of little points that I bring in from the Hebrew Bible, and that is that what Andrew just said suggests a sort of a dynastic approach, whereas the Bible is very, very clear that Moses, who was the great leader, his sons were just not in there at all. They're just not. They're from the time they're circumcised, they're overlooked. So the idea of dynasty doesn't come through that. And the other thing was the Samuel, who was really disparaging of the people when they asked him to make a king, appoint a king over them. He said, you know, you don't need a human king, you have God. You've got a divine king. And so I think that the inevitability of that kingship and that it should be dynastic, I don't think really, you know, there are some good examples where it doesn't apply, you know.
Isn't it also interesting, though, that Samuel is apparently disparaging of populism? Because
yes, he is. Absolutely.
The people say we want a king so that we can be like all the nations round about us.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but this was part and parcel, of course, of the prophetic approach to the Jewish people, which was, you know, you're not like the countries, the nations around you. You are different. You know, retain that difference if only you can. I mean, that changed significantly, of course, in modern times, when Ben-Gurion is on record as saying that Israel will become a nation only when it has murderers and others who are effectively, you know, guilty of crime, and therefore they'll be like other nations. You know, I'm not sure that. But then Ben-Gurion, of course, was not a religious man. So, okay, I think, did I hear that Ruth had her hand up?
Yes. Well, you're judging from the comments that our clergymen have made about Christianity doing better when it's not in government, and judging from the civil situation, the state of Israel at the moment, it seems to me that theology, no matter what religion it is, brings religion into disrepute. Oh, theocracy, I should say, rather.
Okay. I often get posed this in a secular world, you know, the religion is the cause of so many problems in the world.
That wasn't quite what I meant. Not that religion was a problem, but theocracy was.
I think the best thing I can say to that is the common denominator in all issues when we talk about tyranny, political issues, and otherwise, is not God or what God has said, but is man. And I think that's where, if we go back to Churchill's comment, quoting that those that have said that democracy is the worst of governance, but it's the best of what we've got. There is an element in the democratic process where people can't remain in power for significant periods of time, and that there are accountability structures in place to get rid of them if they mess up. And if you look at the more modern origins, I talk about the last 500 years of the democratic process in the United Kingdom, that was born out of the Reformation, which fairly strongly put in stone in the consciousness of the nation that we're inherently selfish and that we make mistakes, and that there's a flawedness to humanity, and therefore we need systems of peer review and systems of checks and balances and governance, because we're going to make errors. And so the thing I would say is it's not necessarily, although some theologies are fairly bad, it's not necessarily the theology itself or the idea itself. The common denominator in all of these areas is actually man and not God.
So on the whole, having priests, rabbis, imams, whatever they are, getting mixed up in government, it does not really enhance God's reputation.
No, and I think the danger is, and this is where we really do need to be wise, is that it doesn't matter what title we've given a person, they're still a human being with flaws. And the danger is to put them on a pedestal as those that must be obeyed and they speak for God. And not expect them to make mistakes. And also it's not fair on them, because it raises them, the pressures upon them and the expectation to come from their lips, that everything they say is going to be dripping with gold and provide solutions to the world. And of course, in all of these examples, we're putting a philosophy, a statement, or a person in the position of God and saying they are the ones with the authority to speak over our lives. Right? Nobody is good but God, is the way Jesus would put it. And certainly they would say that in the Jewish tradition as well, and that it is God who is supreme. And I know from some of my reading of the traditions of Judaism, that the reverence for the scriptures, the Torah themselves, the reverence for what God has spoken is above humanity and above man. And most rabbis, if they put the Torah on the plinth, whatever it's called in the Jewish tradition, will kneel before it, and it'll be above them because it informs them, they don't inform it. And I think that's where man makes the mistake, when we start using scripture for our own ends.
Thank you, Gareth. That's really a super explanation. I really appreciate that. Ian, do we have time for another question?
We have a little bit of time, Maurice. I'm aware that Andrew has to go, and I know we want to thank him for all that he's contributed today.
Absolutely, and I just wondered, Andrew, if you'd like a word, just to take a word or two to either sum up or just to add anything at this stage.
Sure. Well, thanks very much. I am going to go off in about a minute. I will just say that as a priest, the law of my church forbids me from being involved in politics at all.
Yes, exactly.
I think there are a few cases where Catholic priests have done things like that, like in the Sandinista regime and in liberation theology, and in the Mexican Civil War, things like that. But they're fairly rare, and I think rightly so. The role of the clergy is yes, is to challenge and be prophetic, but our role isn't to tell people how to vote or to approve one political party or another. So I think we can be political with a small p and comment on political issues, but it would be wrong for us to take sides or even to get involved in politics ourselves. The theocracy, as it were, is not a thing that works through politics. God governs the world, yes, but he does so first of all, foremost, through the natural law which he's created, which we see working in everything from, gravity to human reproduction. And he governs the world also through the spiritual world and through speaking to the hearts and minds of his children. So if I want to change things in politics, what I do is to pray. So God bless you.
Andrew, thank you very, very much. You really made a wonderful contribution to this afternoon's topic. Thank you. I'd like to, much appreciated. And I hope your next session goes as well as this one.
Thank you very much, Maurice, and thank you, Gareth, and thank you, Ian. Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
Can I briefly add?
So whilst we have this idea of just a word of summation, Gareth, can I come back to you on that?
Yeah, just coming back for the topic, I think democracy, the majority and tyranny, I think what I've outlined as best I can is that democracy is far more complex than that. And it's not simple matter of the majority opinion holding sway. Sometimes it's actually the minority opinion that holds sway in democratic decisions and governance. And I think the priority is to recognize that democracy is the best we've come up with over the period of human civilization so far, that creates a level of personal sovereignty, a level of input into the governance of a nation, which for our own nation is about 60 million strong. And I think the priority is to make sure that as a nation and as members of the nation, that we do our best to remain as informed as possible, to stand up for the importance of people being able to express their opinion, whether we agree with it or not. Live with a level of tolerance in the truest sense of the word, which is putting up with those things we disagree with, rather than forcing everybody to find agreement with the things we agree with. And then beyond that, both praying for our leaders and also holding them accountable for the decisions they've made and the things they promise. And that is the function of a good democratic system. And it is the best we have managed to come up with and brought a level of peace to the world that we live in. The only thing I would say from a spiritual perspective is that most of Western democracy is built on the back of Christian principles, Christian culture, and Christian humility. And if we abandon those, then we don't have a shared sense of manners. And so if we are going through a modern experiment of the abandonment of our Christian principles for the next however many years, once the institutions again are formed on the back end of COVID, or even the climate crisis, if we are going down that route, then we will have a very different culture for a period of time. And as Christians, our responsibility will again be to pray for our leaders, will again be to live our lives as best we can with peace with the government, but not compromising on our belief systems or our faith. And also trusting that the Lord knows what he's doing in these moments as well, because at the end of the day, it's not our power, but his we depend on. And know that he's gotten the church and he's gotten the Jewish nation through periods in their history of horrendous difficulty. And yet he's still on the throne. He's not disturbed by it all. And his plan and purposes will out in the world we live in. And I think there is a confidence that we can have, which is faith in its truest word, that God is good, he's still able. And in the midst of not knowing what's going on, he's actually the stability point that we depend on. Bless you.
Gareth, thank you very much. That's a beautiful summing up. I appreciate very, very much. Ian, would you like to comment at all?
I'd only comment, Maurice. I'm not going to at all attempt to take further what our excellent speakers have said today and the really good contributions from the audience. But my role, I think, as a continuity guy, kind of, is to link it into next week. When we're picking up what's been some of the issues that have been raised about the media. And we have with us next week, amongst our panelists, a representative of the Echo. I think we've probably got the senior editor, Darren Slade, on board. And we also have Mike Apps, who is a BBC TV reporter for this area. So these two gentlemen have agreed to come along and talk about, in a sense, the pragmatics of operating the media on operating in the media on a day-to-day basis, and how it relates to their beliefs and principles and respond to our questions about beliefs and principles. And we've got Chief Superintendent Ben Hargreaves in the chair next week. And I hope all of us and more, get your friends on board, coming back on board next Wednesday at 3 p.m. and use exactly the same Zoom link, please, for each of these Wednesdays right through until March, right, you know, for the whole of this session until March the 24th. So grateful to you, Maurice, for being in the chair. Grateful to you, Gareth, and to Father Andrew, who's gone now. Excellent range of engagement and involvement from everybody today. Thank you very much indeed. I'm now going to press stop record, But we'll look forward to being together again, this time next week. God bless you all.